So yeah, I'm going to introduce the motion and I'm going to introduce the sides that the debaters are on. They have already been given their preparation time, so we will start as soon as everyone is ready. For those of you who want to write down notes, that is very, very fine. You're very welcome to do that. If you want to practice judging, that is also fine. Because we want to make this as much of an educational experience as possible, I will be sharing the verdicts that I have from this debate as well. So all of you are highly, highly encouraged to do that. Yes, with that said, let's move on to the motion. Wait, let me just check if Yuntan is here. We don't want to leave anyone out.
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay, Yuntan's here, that's great. Okay, moving on to the motion. So the motion that we have for today's round is this House regrets the belief that forgiveness is a virtue. So we thought that it would be nice for us to have a philosophy motion or a regret motion with some of the most highly qualified debaters that we have. So yes, on opening government, we have Chi Sung-jang as Prime Minister, and we have Ye Won-chung as Deputy Prime Minister. In opening opposition, we have Hoi Mian from SDS as the leader of opposition. We have Seok Jin from HDS as our deputy leader of opposition. On closing government, we have Song Jae-hong from ADS as our member of government, and we have Hyun Seo-lee from YUU as our government whip. On closing opposition, we have Lucy Kim from HDS/KUDC as the member of opposition, and finally we have Yoon Chun-gu from Sura as the opposition whip. I will stop sharing the screen, so everyone please write down the motion, or the secretariat will share the motion in the chat. So please just keep that in mind, because I want you to have the full experience of looking at the debaters while they give their speech. Yes, with that said, I will be keeping time, but I will not be unmuting myself. So I will be clapping, but you will not hear me, you will just see me. So everyone, please time yourself to make sure that you don't give 8-minute speeches. That is very, very long for us, for all of us. So yeah, with that said, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to begin their speech. Here.
G.
Yeah?
How do you POI? Do I just unmute and
Unmute and give it. But please don't barack. So please, yeah, 15-second rule. Yeah.
Okay.
Another question. So whenever you're ready, Prime Minister, please begin your speech.
Am I audible to everyone? Okay.
Yes, you are.
From now on. Okay. So forgiveness can make a lot of things possible, but we don't think all of those things are good, because the possibility of forgiveness is not intended as a way to escape proper compensation and allow people to manipulate the system and harm others with impunity. We think that forgiveness can erase many things, but it can't erase the wrongdoing the perpetrator has already committed, nor the need for proper atonement. Sometimes, therefore, taking the side of the press can actually mean withholding forgiveness in certain contexts. So what kind of context are we talking about forgiveness? We're talking about it in all sorts of contexts, in interpersonal relationships and in the criminal justice systems too. And when we mean forgiveness, we generally mean giving up one's rightful morally reactive attitudes, such as resentment or blaming the perpetrator of the wrongdoing. So in the current status quo, the social narrative is that through education and religion, people have been actively teaching individuals to believe that a moral person must forgive to learn a person that has clearly done a wrongdoing to him or her. First argument is about the principle of moral responsibility. We think that the problem with the framework that we're talking about in this debate today is that it places an implicit shame on individuals that refuse to forgive and pressures individuals to forgive when they even don't want to. We think that this, therefore, superficial forgiveness really is superficial at the end of the day, because first of all, there really isn't true forgiveness. And therefore, it only causes people to falsely and superficially forgive each other. We think that this is very, very problematic, principally in many ways. We think that the very fact that the pressure exists on individuals means that it devalidates their need for proper compensation and revenge. We actually see that the current criminal justice system is not only about vengeance and people overemphasizing proportionality in criminal punishment. And we think that this claim is actually very misleading to many victims. We think that victims' feelings of vengeance are actually can be justified, but are belittled under this kind of narrative where forgiveness is seen as the dominant virtue. B, we think that then the people that have done the wrongdoings have no incentive to better themselves. We think that there's no incentive to further satisfy and compensate the victim because they end up with the current social narrative that because I have been forgiven, there needs to be nothing that more that needs to be done. Forgiveness is just seen as a tokenistic excuse and a free pass for everything, even when the atonement has not taken place. And C, because they are, no thank you, left off the hook, we think that they're more likely to, in the future, to go around and harm other people because they really haven't understood the weight of their crime. They really haven't gone through the process of begging for forgiveness when the victim has actually felt that he or she is ready to forgive. We think that this social narrative puts on a rushed-on forgiveness process, and the perpetrators, it is even harmful for the perpetrators because they cannot grasp the weight of the crimes that they have committed. Now let's move on to what kinds of harms it does to interpersonal relationships. D, we think that it leads to an ironic situation when perpetrators actually start to expect forgiveness normatively. We think that they start to expect forgiveness of the people that they have harmed because this is a narrative that actually highly educated and moral people do, is to forgive other people like Jesus and the Bible and whatsoever has said. We think that because without true forgiveness, because it is so superficial, like I have said at the beginning of my speech, we think that these unresolved feelings of decompensation is actually lurking at the very bottoms of every relationship. So even from people's perspective, it's better to fully resolve issues at the moment and have true conversation and communication, but this is not going to be actually possible in the current world where the social narrative for forgiveness is so strong. And F, yes?
Point. Okay. Will forgiveness still exist in your world?
We think that it may exist when the victim actually think is ready, but we think that in the current status quo, what is happening is not healthy. It's not healthy and is very toxic for many people. And we think that because of this reason, further attempts and efforts to be truly forgiven, which is not unlike the current status quo, like the POI, is what creates a sustainable and stable relationship, unlike the current status quo. Now, I'd like to move on to the second argument about how existing power structures actually enforce this narrative for their own benefit. We think that this actually, in many cases, stresses out victims because it often hinders necessary social progress and whistleblowing in many cases. For example, the Me Too movement was actually able to succeed because the victims were able, very strong and a very small number of victims were able to go against the social pressure that they actually need to forgive the perpetrators. We think that even though they have been able to do so, many people are not strong enough to do so, and this is actually going to have a very vicious cycle for the victims of sexual or rape or disenfranchisement or many other crimes. For example, we think that in the case where the former mayor, for example, committed a heinous sexual crime, the victim faced coercion to forgive the former mayor, given the fact that he left, for example, he has a great family or he has done many great actions as a mayor. We think that those kinds of things, those kinds of coercions that is given to the victim, that is not actually related to the principle and the nature of the crime itself, is very harmful. And the same applies for Black communities in regarding to Black Lives Matter. We think that the impact is that the abusers may convince their victims that calling out abuse is merely the abuse party's failure to reconcile. We think that it belittles the crime's weight, like we said in the first argument. We think that when forgiveness is the only virtue that is taken seriously, distinguishing between the good and evil is very hard. We think that it makes it impossible for many people to name injustice as injustice and call out people when they have actually gone through so much abuse. And we think that it makes so much easier for wrongdoers, evildoers to muddy the waters, and therefore we're very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 5 seconds. Yes, and also just a reminder to everyone, please mute yourself, especially if you're not a debater, but for debaters as well, mute yourself if you're not getting a POI so that we can focus on the person who is giving the speech. Yes, thank you so much to the Prime Minister. To start the case for opposition, I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition. Here.
I am audible, right? My speech start now. I want to remind the judges that the Prime Minister have not told us what is virtue really means and what is forgiveness really mean. I think by that style of way to debate, it also show that they cannot object that forgiveness is a bad thing to do. So as a leader of oppositions, I want to tell you what does forgiveness actually mean and why it has to be a virtue in the society and it's the world that we want to live. Forgiveness does not mean that the actions of the wrongdoer is justified or that we want to free the wrongdoer from the law and CGS system or even forgetting. What it means is that you know that you cannot undo the pain because note that in the both world, you cannot reverse the pain or take away the pain from those victims. Therefore, the debate should be about asking the questions, which side and which world better healing those victims after the wrongdoing have already been done and cannot be converted. And therefore, forgiveness take a higher stand of accepting and require a stronger strength of morality and mentality to actually forgive those perpetrators. And why does it have to be a virtue? Once something become a virtue, it means that it regards as a high moral standard. It also means that the society recognize that it is not an easy thing for you to do. It's not intuitive as a human being. And once achieved, it's not only just good for you as an individual, but it is also create a bigger outcome for the society. And it come a long way with practice and patience and so on. So I want to remind you the sad reality of this world is that humans have evolved through wars. If we look at any country in this world, there's no country there's no country that have been created or free from war. Therefore, all of us are the victim of war or even a civil unrest and some leader and what's not. So without forgiveness, we cannot progress as we are right now and find peace with ourselves and society. The government burden is not to say that forgiveness is bad and what's not. We have to debate in a world where forgiveness exists in both worlds, but without in a society where in a society where forgiveness is not a virtue, how are those people react and how are those people reconcile with the wrongdoing that keep continuing happening and already happened in the past, right? So one thing I want to note about the Prime Minister's speech, right? That she want to object the idea of superficial forgiveness. But I think when we say something as a virtue, it also means that we promote the genuine forgiveness, and we can say that there are a lot of other things to combat those superficial forgiveness. I'll take you later, like those superficial forgiveness. So she say that, oh, you might not able to commit or get your compensation and what's not. But we think that there are a lot of other mechanisms that exist to help cater to those things, such as CGS, such as law. That's why we have a law, that's why we have international law for you to seek compensations and so on and so forth. And actually it's better under our world. So before I move on to my argument, yes, I'll take from CG if they have any.
Do you seriously think that the victims of Compar women in Korea should be able to forgive Japanese imperialists even when they do not receive meaningful compensation or anything?
Okay, so the meaningful compensation, I don't think it's come with forgiveness or not. You can still forgive people for you to actually live a better life rather than always constantly live in the past and always thinking about the past and hold hatred. We want to also focus on this individual to have a closure and moving on, but also still get the compensations that needed. I don't think when these people only have hatred, like the compensation is just magically just like provide them 100% justice. So we are better provide them with this model. So let's move on to my first principle argument. Why do we think that it is necessary to regard this as a virtue? Again, I want to notify that this debate is not about forgiveness is good or not, but a world with forgiveness as a virtue. So who are we as a person? I think human nature is like a hunter. We're likely to seek revenge because that's our body reactions. And in those wrongdoing and pain, our body tend to be even more irrational to do something that harm and very, very short-term oriented. And the motivation there is strong. But revenge does not always brings the best outcome. It's an irrational thought and a further harm to further generations, not only yourself, but a furthermore. So when virtue is seen as a guideline and as a virtue, we are incorporate a nudge theory over here. So virtue is stabilized to the irrational tension and reactions that we have in the moment that we feel pain. When we know that there's nothing can be changed or reverse the pain, we need to move on in order for us to actually live a normal life. And only forgiveness can provide that platform for you. And it does not apply to like oppressor and what's not, because I want to note that, for example, if it's a bad government, I think those are something that can be changed and have impact on the future, because those are democracy and not necessary in forgiveness and so on and so forth. So war people who already did us wrong in the past, the scar remain, but forgiveness allowed you to let go of the trauma and give yourself chance to heal. We don't want to see comfort women in Korea always living in a constant pain where they always think about the past, but we want them to actually learn and accept that this is something that cannot be changed, but it is not something that is justified, and compensation is still needed. No, thank you. So let's move on to my second argument. Why do we think that forgiveness is the only way to properly heal? As a human being, we can still survive with hatred and so on and so forth. But this allowed you to only live in a constant past, sorrow, and pain. The only and most genuine way for you to actually move on and fully heal is forgiveness. What do forgiveness actually means to people, right? I think they have not like provide you a clear forgiveness. They only talk about superficial forgiveness. So when we already told you that no, if we want to promote a genuine forgiveness, does it mean that they also concede that it is a good thing to have in the society and that's the world that we want to live in? I think forgiveness means that you go beyond yourself to understand that human beings have bad and good in itself, that human beings have a possibility of human change. It's also influenced by many ideology, although it's not justified, but we understand that they does not necessarily like inherently evil to cause us harm. It also forces you to be more current and future oriented. Like, I'm willing to let the past be the past, but we have to discuss what can you have to what do you need to change in order for you to have to, for us to live in this society and further on. This process cannot just up to individual. Why do we put this as a virtue? Because as a human being, again, we need to have a strong standard for us to guide us through. Otherwise, our natural human reactions will force us to act irrationally and hatred and so on. I will give you an example of South Africa in 1995. After the apartheid, it collectively create a truth and reconciliation commissions to uncovering the truth in the human violation actions to those people and let the victim and those perpetrators to come and forgiveness. This is the way that they take in order to move society forward. I think South Africa without forgiveness will not actually be healed and will not be what it is today. Very, very proud to propose. Unopposed.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 17 seconds. To continue the case for opening government, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Just a second, I'll start my timer. Just a second. So, right, so times, okay, what happened to me? Okay, so the time starts now. Okay. Every human lives a life full of sins. An extreme few are brave enough to seek forgiveness, and even fewer are truly forgiven. This is my favorite quote from Shinhwa Hamke, a movie that probably all of you guys watched. I think, yes, true forgiveness is beautiful. It vibrates our hearts. It is what we stand for. But I don't think it's fair for the opposition side to cherry pick society's beliefs and narratives on the term of forgiveness. Because when they say that upholding forgiveness means putting forgiveness as a high moral standard that is hard to perform, yet is honorable. And also they claim that upholding something as a virtue also means upholding true forgiveness. I think number one, they are cherry picking how the society views forgiveness and what this belief actually does to other human beings. Because despite the intention of this narrative and the intention of this virtuous belief that they want to sell to you at the end of the day, the way through which this is accepted to people, at least, is that if you do not perform the act of forgiveness, you are not a desirably moral person, and therefore you should be shamed. That is realistically how society accepts it. And as much as we would like the narrative to be that way, and as much as we would like people to accept the narrative that way, that is not reality. And therefore, they cannot cherry pick that specific bit. But also, I think it's very, very preposterous for them to argue that victims must forgive in order to truly move on. Because I think this is a leisure of some victims that have the capacity and the leisure to be able to forgive. But what about victims that went through so much trauma and therefore cannot forgive? To which I think and societal narratives are violent against them. Perhaps these societal narratives pressure these individuals into forgiving. And that is what I think is the problem here. Because I think a lot of the perpetrators in society, be it sexual abusers, be it the Japanese government, be it the powerful ones in society that has committed a wrong to a weaker individual in terms of the power structures that realistically exist. I would argue that the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue, that narrative is what these powerful people hide behind as the moral justification for their actions. They claim that, look, I know that I've done something wrong, but because it's a virtue, you should forgive me. This is the moral line of logic and rhetoric that these people have been running that allows them to hide what they've done and offer proper compensation to these victims, to which these victims are largely forced to accept the apology without really being appeased. And therefore, these people and perpetrators and the people within the power structures actively use this as a tokenistic way of evading further burdens of compensating the victim. We've seen that in so many cases regarding sexual crimes and regarding the perpetrators within the Me Too movement, etc., etc. I think that is a trade-off that we have to answer, because the POI I was about to ask Lehman was this: then would you not encourage forgiveness? Because as far as they are still willing to encourage forgiveness to the degree that more people are willing to forgive under their world, the same problems will exist under their model anyway, to which I think the trade-off of this debate still applies. And I think that's why I'm going to reanalyze this debate. Number one, it's not our burden to defend a world devoid of other moral values like altruism, respect for human dignity, etc., etc. In short, we don't have to defend the war of all against all, where mankind has been reduced to a species of pure vengeance and mundane needs, right? So therefore, our burden is to defend a counterfactual world where individuals are less likely to forgive unless they have been reasonably satisfied in accordance to the context they're in and are more likely to seek reasonable vengeance, right? I think this is our burden. And if Queenie's question in today's debate was, will forgiveness exist under our model? Yes, but we accept the trade-off in the sense that there will be a lot less forgivenesses, in the sense that we prefer a world where false forgivenesses don't exist and only true forgivenesses exist. And that is why I think the trade-off that perhaps we are trying to accept in today's debate is that perhaps it will take a lot longer on our world to recover relationships because individuals are less likely to forgive. But I think this is a trade-off that we'll gladly take if that means better recovery and true recovery of relationships, which is a value that we try to uphold. Number two, and I think this is probably what Sokjin will run. Opposition side cannot fiat that with a social narrative that forgiveness is a virtue, we can ensure total moral indoctrination of individuals, which would erase the feelings of sentiment of revenge from individuals completely and magically enable individuals to truly forgive each other. Because no education, religion, or even drugs in the status quo in the past have been remotely successful in achieving this goal. But even if this is possible, we would argue that moral values should not be indoctrinated, and therefore, in the worst case scenario that they can argue against our side, which is that perhaps there will be more revenge crimes on our world because people are more vengeance and seek more vengeance, I would say that that is highly, highly unlikely. In which case, I would say that we defend our worst case scenario rather more successfully in the sense that in our world, and this is actually an additional benefit that I would like to mention, because I would say that a society that validates righteous vengeance and respects the need of victims to see proper punishment being delivered to perpetrators and criminals, these kind of societies would have a criminal justice system well geared towards retribution and would therefore have harsher, stricter punishment against criminals. Therefore, we think that more victims would be better appeased and therefore feel less of a need to perform vigilante revenge outside the existing legal framework, and due to the possibly increased deterrence effect of crimes, perhaps, I think, that we would be able to appease victims better and therefore respect their feelings better. I think this is why we've been having constant controversies about the feelings of the law that people have, 국민법감정, where perhaps we feel that people are underpunished in the case of N1방, in the case of Podusun, etc., etc. We think that the compliance with the law and the compliance with the social system actually increases in a more healthier way with our model, which I think is better for a healthier society that we want to promote. But in the end, we think that this is a defense against our worst case scenario. I think the opposition side needs to be able to defend their worst case scenario, and a worst case scenario that we see prevalently in society, where victims are judged and victims are forced into a narrative of forgiveness, and a powerful hide behind the idea of forgiveness as a means of hiding, as a means of defending themselves. I think that is a violence that the greatest violence that we can possibly commit against the victims that may exist. And for a lot of the reasons that we've mentioned, we tell you that we value true forgiveness. And that's why a narrative that values true forgiveness in and of itself might not be harmful, but the implications and the effect that it has on society is seriously harmful. And that's what opposition side needs to debate on. So far, they have not been embracing the trade-off. So far, they have not been embracing the trade-off of having and influencing individuals to forgive, how they are willing to mitigate the harms of that. Proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 31 seconds. To conclude the case for opening half, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Wait, oh, sorry, my screen just turned off, sorry. Give me a bit. Oh, great, it's okay. So what I'm gonna do in my speech is I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna first try to break down this idea of this victims versus perpetrator dichotomy. I'm gonna explain the world isn't that black and white. There are very gray areas in this issue. I want to expand the scope of the debate. I want to also engage to, I want to clarify what this debate exactly about and what exactly does it mean to have an absence of forgiveness as a virtue, and then also want to talk about why in the most important context about post-conflict societies and social movements, why this is a much better trade-off that we are able to get. So let's first clarify what this debate is actually about, because Jisung told us that basically the absence of the forgiveness as a virtue means that, well, sometimes the people would access legal metrics and legal measures in order to ensure that their vengeance is served well. I don't think this is true, right? Hillman already told you in her speech about why exactly that the idea of vengeance and catharsis you feel from so is something that is far more dominant. Therefore, that's exactly the reason why we need to enforce these extra narratives that ensure people come over these things. But also because the idea that forgiveness takes time does not matter, obviously shows you the fact that just because I forgive someone does not mean that I will, for example, just because I forgive a murder does not mean I would then send these people free and not make these people go to jail. Obviously, because A, that you still want some level of justice, so therefore you'll probably report these people to jail. But the question is, after you send these people to jail, what is the thing that you want? Therefore, I don't think the example of Sungjae, for example, talking about comfort woman, makes sense either. If there isn't proportional justice that is done as of now, we still think that under our role, we as of status quo, where we do preach that forgiveness is a virtue, we think it's still possible that we find justice. The problem is under governance world, it's harder for you to get proportional justice because the cyclical nature of vengeance spreading to the people, not only to the immediate perpetrators, but also to, for example, people who weren't directly responsible, like family members. And you see how generations and generations of violence and spreads. We think that the idea that a world is proportional is simply wrong. But I'll take it later. So also, I want to point out the fact that they can't simply say that these are recurring structural problems. Not all events are simply recurring and structural, right? Think about global events, like, for example, war. It's also about if this is not going to repeat again, how do I internalize the pain that I feel? It's also things like, for example, if I, found someone who was drunk driving and I send that person to jail, probably it's likely that this problem wouldn't reoccur, but it's more about how I internalize the pain and how I overcome the pain, right? Secondly, I don't think government can simply say rehabilitation is bad, right? Because A, especially people who are minority status, people who have been forced by the conditions to commit crimes, I think it's necessary for our society to forgive these people. Even it's about forgiveness is about understanding there's a human part of that person instead of thinking of these people as scum, right? So it's much more harder for us under their world for us to actually try to reform these people. And the problem is, you see, like, for example, the prison industrial complex in America, where recidivism is extremely high. We think that's actually caused a lot of restrictions on freedom to not only these people, people, but also to society as a whole because of the costs that we face. But last of all, even if these people are actually bad and there isn't possibility of change in these people, we think that we think it's also want to talk. We already told you that probably the likely scenario in our world is that we probably do have some level of systematic justice, right? You're probably likely that we think that even if I want to forgive that person in the future, I still want to immediately make that person serve some level of justice, and therefore I don't think that our burden is to like prove that, oh, we'll just let go of everyone else. But then I think also the problem of government side is that basically they assume that people would then only stick to rational retribution. I think no, this is rather, it is less likely to be proportionate, right? For example, this is likely that individuals will seek their own private revenge because they believe that even the system as of now, as a government talks about, is not enough to punish these people, that they deserve to suffer more. And this looks like things that the level of disproportionality is likely to then expand to different actors as well. And this is exactly why, for example, why you see like generations after generations killing each other's families and members, and now I feel anger, therefore I want to go back and revenge, and problem ensues. But yeah, POI.
So you guys are very good at complaining against our worst case scenario, which we reasonably defended. Defend your worst case scenario, where perhaps the minorities are suppressed by the powerful because in using this narrative, which I think is a burden you guys never answer.
Oh, I'm getting there. Sorry, that's my second part. So secondly, I'm going to talk about why social movements and post-conflict societies oftentimes is a problem that we think is worse off than their world, right? So let's compare our world and their world. So our world is a world where we have social conditioning. We try to ensure that even if it's hard, that we try to get some understanding of each other. And notice the fact that forgiveness takes place not only for these oppressors, oppressed, but also the oppressors as well, because obviously there's probably been some social conflict that makes also the so-called oppressors likely to have resentment towards the oppressed, right? So let's compare these two worlds. First of all, we think it's likely that the oppressors, once they internalize this notion of forgiveness as a virtue, considering that, for example, like the United States, like, you know, Christianity is like obviously very a majority group, and they preach this to different people, that it's likely that these people are less likely to look at these oppressed people who probably had like historical problems with as people who are simply scum, right? It's more likely that you try to understand and try to look at the human goodness inside these people, instead of thinking like, for example, like in countries like the Sudan, where the Hutus thought the Tutsis were scum. I think it's better to try for these people to forgive about the previous dynamics that happened before when the colonizers actually worked along with the Tutsis, right? So I think these are examples that show the dynamics can shift, and therefore there is resentment on both worlds. I think therefore under our world, we're more likely to get things like, for example, more social integration. We're likely to get things like more public support for integrated programs, for educational programs, in order to ensure these people get better conditions. That's like their best case world. But let's look at what their worst case world is, because I think under their worst case world, they never engage a scenario where under gov and op, you can't get structural information, because like the likelihood of you fighting against oppressors is not going to automatically mean that you get the reform that you want. Likelihood is you get squashed. The likelihood is that another likelihood is that you probably aren't strong enough to fight against your oppressors, right? We think the situation becomes worse off under their role, because now you fight wars that you'll never win. Look at, for example, the constant terrorism happens within the Middle East against the United States. There's no likeliness that probably these ISIS terrorists will win against the United States. The problem is because the cycle of hatred is much more likely that it's much more harder for you to opt out of it, and a rational idea. I don't think Gov can say, oh, but then they'll be rational and they won't try to fight this unbeatable war. No, because the very idea of this historical hatred is out of order. Historical hatred is likely to make it much more harder for you to opt out of this narrative, and exactly why we need to forgive. But also because that your actions are likely to then increase the escalation of violence, because now the perpetrators will be damaged, and therefore they are more likely to then be more oppressive to your group or your ethnicity or whatnot. I think it is better off if we have a system where we forgive, for example, our oppressors, because then it's less antagonistic for them, but also in a world where oppressors learn to become more virtuous towards others, and therefore try to forget about the historical problems. I think that's the world in which can allow us to make a more rational consensus and discussion, rather than leaving up to the vengeful mindsets of these people, which can therefore hurt people who have been bystanders or people, other families of the oppressors, and therefore go on a cycle of violence. If you think the problem of this world is that basically people are rational enough to not go beyond the scope of like, what was that? Proportional revengeance. Look at status quo. We see so many civil wars happening. I don't think it's because that people were able to make rational calculuses about what is the best moment to stop. Exactly because vengeance is an emotion that destroys everyone. Very proud to post.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 45 seconds. That concludes the opening half of this debate. I'd like to invite the Member of Government to start the closing half. Here.
Give me 1 minute. I just got out of the car.
Are you standing up to give the speech?
No, I'm sitting down. All set. 2 points of extension. Firstly, why the concept of forgiveness inherently is a morally problematic concept to begin with. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the socio-political implication of this particular narrative. From closing government, we will go far significantly beyond what opening government says because they just labeled the argument but never gave reasonings to believe why that's an important one. For that, let's take the previous speaker out because Sakino came up with this bizarre argumentation of like, oh, but oppressors will be somehow benevolent if you forgive. Like, you shouldn't go on a full-fledged war against oppressors because you're gonna like die because oppressors are so strong. Firstly, I think it's quite unclear to me why you would want to forgive oppressors who literally crush your livelihoods to begin with, just for the sake of some sort of a future abstract happiness which they cannot even propose. I think the problem of forgiving oppression is that it creates a societal precedent that it's okay to be an oppressor, that it's okay to oppress other people's democracy, insofar as you can somehow persuade your citizens to let go of you at the end of the day. Secondly, I just don't buy the dichotomy of opening opposition that the alternative to forgiveness is a full-fledged war. I think anger can be somehow constructive. Anger doesn't have to be mobilized in a full-fledged war manner. But I think the recent protests of Black Lives Matter or the feminist movement are all clear examples of the way in which anger can be constructively and meaningfully constructed. I'm going to further extend on that, why it doesn't exist on that side of the house. Lastly, they want to talk about examples of Hutus and Tutsis and TNCs, and they say like Japanese victims of colonizing should move on from the past. Firstly, this debate is not about forgiveness per se, but it's about societal pressure to tell the victims that you need to forgive. So therefore, the victims that we're defending on our side of the house didn't move away from trauma because of their own autonomy to do so, but because society said that you shouldn't disrupt society anymore, just forget about it and get along with it, right? So it's unclear to me why their idea of trauma moving on is a benefit to begin with. But secondly, Hutu and Tutsis and TNC in Africa are still fighting over regarding past remnants of unsolved political deadlocks everywhere, right? So it's unclear to me why those examples are being beneficial for their side of the house. But more of these contents in my extension. First, let's talk about the idea of moral concept. Why forgiveness is an inherently immoral thing to do. When a moral wrongdoing happens, we think that we as a human being needs to do either one of two things or arguably both. Firstly, we should correct that moral wrong right. Or secondly, we should punish the moral wrongdoer in order to prevent that moral wrongdoing from spreading into our society, or in order to bring some sort of a retributive justice with it, in regards to that wrongdoing. The characteristic of forgiveness, which is none of the team's thoughts are talked about, is saying that we're going to close the chapter of this book regarding this particular moral wrongdoing. We're going to just move away from that. Right? That's the overarching narrative that the opposition will be imposing to the entire society because that's the definition of the virtue that we're discussing about. Well, why is this problematic? There are 4 reasons why this ought to be a problematic virtue. Firstly, from the perspective of the victim, the damage that has been done upon you does not change, right? So even if you decide to forgive a perpetrator, the conditions that you have been worse off in a compared to a situation where it otherwise could have been does not change. So the harm objectively done to you doesn't change, so it's bad for victims. Secondly, for the victims, we think that some sense of closure can be provided when the society legally punishes the perpetrator and society says that you have done nothing wrong, but here's the justice for you. Option side inhibits this thing from the first place because the societal pressure to forgive means that you're going to victim blame the victims of, for instance, sexual harassment, even if she or he decides to bring that case to the court. Why are you bringing it up all again? You decided to forgive them. That inhibits the likelihood of legal reconciliation.
Clearly, and most importantly, harm is never individualized, right? For two reasons. Firstly, if you forgive the wrongdoer, you're necessarily telling them that what you did is okay. So in the case of, for instance, an abusive relationship, when you say okay to an abusive boyfriend, then you're forgiving him, then it is likely that boyfriend will act in a similar way to other girlfriends. No, thank you. But secondly, it is a societal precedent that you let go of, that you have just created a society in which date violence is permissible because it's okay. Well, the last moral problem of this idea is that the idea of forgiveness just like makes the entire concept of morality meaningless, right? Because the idea of right and wrong is not considered by some objective way of understanding morality, but it's determined by the subjective feelings of the person who's trying to forgive, right? So you just like destroy the entire meaning of the whole moral conduct. I think this is precisely important here, because our extension is not contingent on a particular premise, but we're telling you why the action in and of itself is immoral to begin with. No, thank you. Secondly, let's talk about the social impact. I want to talk about two things. First, let's talk about interpersonal relations. We think that this particular narrative intertwines with every other narrative that's already pre-existing in our society. So in the case of interpersonal relationship, telling you that you need to forgive the abusive boyfriend oftentimes intertwines with the narrative that it's for your own well-being. Don't let the abusive boyfriend take away your life. Just forget about it. Don't bring the situation up again, and just move along and carry on with your lifestyle. But then again, like it ties back to all the first argumentation that I told you, how the harm's never individualized but manifested within an entire society. But crucially, that individual starts to hate yourself, because the idea of forgiveness necessarily ties the responsibility of solving the entire societal confusion to the victims. If you just be quiet about it, if you just don't care about it enough, everyone will be fine. Why are you disrupting society even when it's not something that matters to you? That literally brings the impact of gaslighting the victims. It is the victims that are wrong when that is not the problem, when that is not the actual problem, and we should bring some sort of a recidivist justice to the society. Secondly, social movement. I don't think the dichotomy is like full-fledged social war. The problem with forgiveness is that when you tell minorities to forgive, for instance, a particular racist structure, and if the minority indeed truly forgives a particular racist, think about how this would be used and weaponized by the entire Republican apparatus within the United States. Republicans would say that this is the civilized manner in which African Americans should fit into the United States. Why are you using anger? Why are you using violence? But this is problematic, because as the statistics show, 60% of Americans now support the causes of Black Lives Matter. They believe violence is justified, and violence has been, to a certain extent, somewhat effective in terms of changing the society. We think that the society should not forgive them, should be continuously disrupted. They should be angry about things that they should be. Otherwise, societal change will never come, both in practical and a moral sense. We oppose.
I thank the member of government for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 27 seconds. I'd like to invite the next speaker, the member of opposition. Here.
Sorry, just a second. Okay, can you hear without too much white noise?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. Second, let me time. Forgiveness is not forgetting, nor minimizing your hurt, nor forcing you to reconcile, nor to denying it and let you suppress the anger. We think that essentially all the House is now a bit confused about how essentially forgiveness works, and hence there is a gap between what they want to achieve as an ideal society versus how the forgiveness actually changes human being as individual. As a closing opposition, we're going to exclusively give it to you how this mechanism works for individual, hence the link back to the society, which is a value that we'd like to propose as a healthy ones. We think that essentially it is very important to understand this idea of forgiveness in the beginning. We think that there has been continuous arguing from the proposition saying that this is like being forced and this is very bad and this is being influenced. Number one, the very essential definitional concept of forgiveness is about how it's intentional and also voluntary process. There's no mechanism described in the proposition saying that how this is actually being forced. Because even if the people say, oh, this is virtue, doesn't mean that they will actually know how your own mindset will work. And then even more importantly, we think that it's the fact that it's a virtue also respect the forgiveness process, how the process of forgiveness works. We think when CG comes to you and say that, oh, Republican, all these bad people would take advantage of the concept of this and then not try to rig you. No, because we think that it's also probably will be able to understand how this is shameful action for misusing the concept of virtue, especially when virtuous things is something that our society try to protect. I'm going to tell you more exclusively why this is the case, understanding the concept and the process of how forgiveness works. We think when we say the virtue and virtuous thing, what we as a closing option want to propose to you is that understand and try to empathize with how the process of forgiveness works. Why this is important. We think that when you talk about forgiveness, there a lot of different ways that people start and the time that they are taking. But when we say that there are 5 steps according to like a psychology of forgiveness works, like consider from the Worthington's 5 steps, for example, that the first beginning is actually recalling the hurt, recalling the anger. We think that when that process is being respected, then what we need to understand is when the society tries to pressure that, you also have a right to call, hey, this is a virtuous act. This isn't something that I have a right to be. And then this is the way that I actually can take time to process it. We think that when you fail to do that as a society, you also as a victim as well, you can call out, this is my way of process of forgiving, and this is also should be respected, because only after that process, that action will be also considered voluntary and intentional and hence also virtuous. Let me tell you more about how this whole debate has gone. We think that when there's a lot of discussion of the like CJS and like general forgiveness not happening, we number one, as continuous with the opening, that the whole idea of a criminal justice and forgiveness is a bit separated, because we know that society also respect atrocity and that atrocity and punishment is important. That is different between the how individual will live their life with experience of what they have and hence what they want to perceive. We think that when we talk about virtuous action, it is separated, especially considering this as regret motion, that the world has been involved with the existence of criminal justice along with the concept of forgiveness. When you remember that, what we want to propose here is not about scrapping whole CJS just in order to have the virtue of the forgiveness. It's about how we individuals should be framing our belief and how we should trust in our own power in order to better ourselves and strive for the better human being. Let me tell you about then how we are exclusive in this debate. We think that what everybody is forgetting in this debate is essentially about celebrating the concept of forgiveness. What do I mean by that? We think that when there's a virtuous action as like a forgiveness, that when they talk about how minorities will suppress, etc., we say the opposite. We actually believe that this liberalize and then liberate the individual who are from minority, liberate the people who have been victim. Why is this so? Because when you actually think of how forgiveness is a virtual act and how forgiveness is something that we hope that these people can achieve, then this means that these process that they are going through there is also the steps that they are achieving the higher moral ground, higher like a value that they are holding as a human being. Why so? We think that this forgiveness is actually becoming a drive for you to be better in terms of self-reflecting and self-understanding and even accepting the anger and process that you're having. We think when there's no understanding in how this is virtual action, that people will now just generally and arbitrarily say, oh, I can just do this or not do that. And then this is like my anger, so I will be consumed by anger. One, that we think that anger in itself is different nature with the power of your understanding and power you're striving forward. As a constructivist belief in their mind, that we also believe that how your action is framed by how you believe. That when you believe in the power of virtue, when you believe in the power that I also can forgive them because this is something that I will be respected in the society, this is something that I will have a higher moral ground, that definitely this is a power that you behold yourself, grabbing your sense of agency, being the power, being the one who make a decision of how you're feeling and how the action and the respect or the reception of this particular perpetrator or the people who are harming you in our society. We think that having the virtuous position is also about how you behold the momentum, and the moment to behold that forgiveness and behold that progress of life. We think this is definitely the more healthier way that our society needs to progress, because now you're not only minority, now you're not only we, but you're the one who are going to be in charge of this, making the progress of your own. And then that your decision will be also respected by the society, because again, this is virtuous action. We think the celebration of process of virtue, celebration of process of forgiveness is essentially empowering tool for these people to go forward to. But we also think that it's essentially good because that also makes people to forgive themselves as well. In our conservative, super conservative countries where things are coming to you as a custom, things are coming to your law, some people like a minority, like a women, disabled, all this ethnic minority do feel that they have done something wrong and they've been putting this idea of wrong. But sometimes when people accept that this is also unhealthy, because we think that forgiveness also comes to yourself, not only from all the people out there, but it's also about giving you the room that human can be erring, human can make a flaw, and hence that we can move on forward to that. We think that liberating from your perception that I'm always being constrained with this problem, or like a trap that this society brings to you, that minorities in this particular group of society can also liberate it, because now you can move forward to it with believing that I can forgive what has been put into me, what I believe I have done wrong, and instead I can strive forward from then. We think that power of forgiveness is essential. As Mahatma Gandhi said, that we can never forgive, only if forgiveness is attribute of the strong. We believe the strongness of the individual in our society should be respected, and that should be the virtue of a society, because we want to empower, we want to support the idea of people doing better themselves. Therefore, we are very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 25 seconds. To conclude the case for government, I would like to invite the government whip. Here.
Let's see. We think that the world that we do want to live in is where forgiveness truly happens, when there is a genuine forgiveness that does appear, and when somewhat conflicts between two or more individuals does seem to get better, right? We tell you that is the ideal world that we see. But the world that we see from either the opening opposition or the closing opposition is when they force forgiveness to be there, right? Without you being able to forgive someone, what this is happening is your notion of letting or making someone forgive. We see that the closing opposition talked about, oh, forgiveness is good for you to move on. It's good for you to, I don't know, like for you to change. If you believe in something, then you will probably be able to change, right? We tell you that is the notion in itself, that you're forgiving someone to make a change, even if you don't believe in it. Meaning that even if you don't think that someone has done a good job, you still have to brainwash yourself and believe that someone is doing the right thing, because that is for the sake of yourself and for the society. We deny that, and we tell you that is actually more aggravating on your side of the house. And I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, how it harms the individual, and secondly, about how it disrupts the justice system at the end of the day. So let's move on to the first clash about why it harms the individual. I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, when they talk about that pressure, why this pressure, when the opening government comes up and talks about why this is actually a moment of pressuring, and how this pressure to forgive actually leads on to superficial forgiveness, we tell you that this is going to happen in both interpersonal and when it comes to criminal justice system. Why is it the case? I'm going to extend this into two levels. First of all, we tell you it's superficial because forgiveness happens in two steps. Number one, when you understand that someone has done something and be in their shoes of why that actually happened in the first place. If someone is a psychopath or a sociopath, then you understand, okay, this person may be someone, right? When we tell you something has to be, you have to understand why that has happened in the first place. But secondly, even if you do understand, we tell you that it's crucial for you to understand that you have to sacrifice for your harms that you have received. Meaning that you have to now understand that you have to get away with yourself selfishness, but then understand that there has been certain harms that is created, but I'm still ready to get over it, right? But we tell you that this is actually difficult to achieve because number one, feeling empathy is so difficult already, but secondly, because people are selfish in the first place, they never would like to sacrifice their harms, even when if it's especially when it's something that is like killing your sisters or killing your family, right? But secondly, we tell you that it's not enough for the opposition to say, oh, it's a process for you to go over with. It's a process for you to move on to the next step or the next level of your life, right? We asked the POI from our member that, oh, we see cases of comfort women, that they never being able to move on because there was not enough like apologies, but there was not enough like that itself was a trauma for themselves in the first place, right? We tell you it's actually wrong to assume that people can forgive someone else, especially in circumstances like this when there was so much traumatized harm that was given to that person, right? We tell you forgiveness is about understanding humans. It's not about understanding if humans are good or bad, as the opposition said, but it's rather you are being able to understand why that has happened and you're willing to sacrifice your life, right? We tell you therefore forgiveness is sometimes very hard to happen in either circumstances. But secondly, even if you do move on, we've seen it from societal level on from our member that in your group or your peers or anyone that's above you or like around you may also be harmed by you giving up or you actually sacrificing for your forgiveness, right? I'm going to talk about this later in my class. So let's move on to the third point about why moving on is not necessary when it's actually forced, right? We tell that the true meaning of moving on will not happen. I've told you this pretty clear enough. But secondly, we told you the most important thing is when the opening opposition comes up and tells us that this is problematic, that forgiveness is a virtue, and that you can only become a better person when you forgive someone. We tell you that itself is a forced choice, meaning that we tell you this is where you're forced to forgive, and if at least then you have to forgive someone superficially, right? You superficially have to forgive them because now you're blamed for someone being not so open-minded, that you're now blamed for being someone who has so hooked up or so is not somewhat a good person because you cannot forgive someone, right? Secondly, if this is the case, then why is not being able to show anger so self-destructive? Because first of all, we tell you you're not being able to show anger in the first place because now you're blamed to do so, and now you're blamed by not forgiving someone because now you have to be the one who's suffering, right? We tell you this is actually worse off for the individual who has to suffer internally because you now have to act superficially of how you have to do things, right? Secondly, we tell you if it's superficial, that discrepancy of you having to show, oh, I'm okay with whatever is going on, and you having to suffer internally is what it actually like harms the minority even more, right? Because that forgiveness is in disguise, and it's bad because it's further pressing down the minorities. It's further pressing down the victims for actually showing what's wrong and from showing what's, being wrong done in the first place, right? We tell you that is where these marginalized people are now pressed down to the more further aside, more to the bottom, because they do not have the capability to admit or to actually forgive someone. But now it's actually they have to blame themselves for not being able to forgive, right? Now, then how is the majority now taking over the minorities, right? Why does this happen in a closing opposition case? Because if you believe in something, you change, right? This was the notion that came from closing opposition, right? Number one, we tell you shouldn't change if you think that it's not right? We tell you shouldn't not forgive, or you should not say something if you just think it's not right? What the opposition is doing, forcing anyone in any kind of circumstances to forgive because that is for the good of the society, right? We don't think that's true because we see rather harmful cases, as our member told you, like in comfort women cases or in any kind of like societal cases. But secondly, we told you this again, if you do not want to forgive, then you should not be forced to forgive, right? I'm going to now move on to my second clash about why this disrupts justice system. Number one, we tell you that this distorts justice because oppressors will actually now be incentivized to believe that, oh, I will be forgiven in whatever I do, right? We tell you this is rather going to increase the criminal rates or crime rates, whatever that's going to happen. Secondly, we tell you it's actually going to deter the deterrence effects that is being held in the criminal justice system, because once you commit crime, you simply believe forgiveness is given to you, right? Now, why is this so problematic? Because it stops the discourse. It stops people from having structurally reforming about what is right and what is wrong, because now you're actually banned, or you're actually deterred to speak in what you believe in, to name what is evil and name what is like sin or whatsoever, right? We tell you, by simply naming my anger, that is where discourse starts and where structural reforms start, right? We tell you that the opposition bench is actually deterring or abolishing this from happening. Right, the comparative that we see here is what you feel is more important than how it affects a society. But even if that's the case, we tell you that effect that goes to society is better on our side, because now we actually let these healthy discourses to happen. And we tell you Society evolves more when there is more discourses, when there is a notion of what is right and wrong, and when there is people acknowledging what's actually going to happen. And therefore, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 21 seconds. To conclude this debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Yeah, just give me like 10 seconds. Yeah, so may I begin? So I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. One, why the process of forgiveness inherently is a personal process, and that's the way in which this belief has evolved. Second, we're going to talk about why OG is out of the debate, and why hence therefore the derivative CG case is also out of the debate. And lastly, we're going to talk about why OO didn't prove anything, and therefore we take the debate home. One, why is the process of forgiving inherently personal? Because if you look at all of what Gov's case is hinged upon, it says that forgiveness applies in a coercive way, and because there exists unequal social structures, it applies inadequately to minorities, which we tell you has never been mechanized. Because firstly, we tell you that this happens on a personal process in vast majority of cases. Why? Because A, this is a regrets motion, right? We do have legal structures in place. We do have norms about justice in place because of the extension material that CG gave. Because the harm is not individualized, meaning that to cage another perpetrator from going out and committing another crime, the society has an incentive to make sure that it has structures in place to promote a collective safety. But secondly, and more importantly, we tell you that there's other social norms that actually empower minorities in many cases. For example, we have a norm about justice, that justice is a virtue as well. We have more sympathy towards victims of crimes than perpetrators of crimes. So when the American, I don't know, the example that CG gave, like when you have to forgive other people, then other people can be empowered by other narratives existing in the status quo, by the fact they have more empathy from society, by the fact that there exists other justice in society as well. Which means that this narrative doesn't apply in discussions about law in many cases. It applies on a personal level, on a psychological level, where you are given a process and an autonomy to empower yourself within that atrocious situation. No, thank you. But secondly, more importantly, if you're to assume the worst case scenario where privileged people manipulate all of the narratives, dominate religion, dominate education, they don't prove to you why this is the only narrative that the privileged people can utilize to oppress the minorities, which we tell you, we actually, other narratives like, hey, you're demanding for too much, hey, minorities are being too selfish, would be other narratives of society would be empowering. If you look at how the Me Too movement, how women are discredited, it isn't that women should forgive men of that sexual assault. It says it's okay, it's a natural culture, and that these women are lying. It's other narratives that are more persuasive. If you actually look at how forgiveness is utilized in society, nobody goes like, you should always forgive your perpetrator, you should always forgive a person who murdered your mother. That is just not how it actually looks like in reality. Then, how does it actually look like in reality? Because I think that's what the member of opposition uniquely provides in this motion. The fact that something is a virtue is a recognition of how difficult and hard it is. For example, we recognize how difficult it is for people to forgive of apartheid. We recognize how difficult it is for Gandhi to forgive people of the British people's atrocities, which means that it is okay for you to not opt into that narrative. It is okay for you to take time when you want to forgive your person, when you're perpetrator, because it is a recognition that this is an important value. And this virtue doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists with other narratives and other virtues that exist within the status quo. But we tell you, on the other hand, what this narrative does is that it empowers the victim inherently, because things like justice or things like arbitrary sense of morality are not something that the victim has autonomy over. as government talks about, this is uniquely the narrative. If the victim says, I'm okay, I'm ready to move on, that I'm able to do this. So this doesn't coerce victims. It gives victims autonomy to choose of how to deal with that atrocity, how to deal with the harm that is visited upon them, which is why we think that this is inherently important. So if you look at it, all of this social discourse, things like atrocities, things like law, they don't actually mechanize, but it actually is the result of a single narrative existing within society. The area in which this motion has most impact in is in personalized areas, in the psychological level of an individual. And in that area, we think that it empowers this minority. Second class regarding OG, right? Because OG 1 says that this is effective in justifying injustices. And second says that, hey, this won't create real forgiveness. But I think firstly, if it's effective in pressurizing individuals to be silenced, it would reasonably also be effective in terms of making people internalize certain set of moralities. But second, their argument about vigilante justice is weird, because at the point at which vigilante justice is applied, the norm that you should forgive your perpetrator also exists. So their argument is, this narrative is effective at one point in time and isn't effective in another point in time, which I think they have never mechanized. So that's why OG is out of the debate, and this debate is mostly and most predominantly about the personal process of making that decision. No, thank you. Thirdly, then COO, right? Why they're out of the motion, right? Because if you look at how Seok Jin-young mechanizes his arguments, it's things like, hey, like, minorities cannot demand liberation or policy changes from the privileged majority anyways. Hey, if minorities argue for no compromise, they're going to be antagonized by other individuals. These are things inherently that is reliant on other people making decisions on behalf of you. So for example, the idea that you shouldn't antagonize yourself is predicated under the assumption that the majority will be prevalent, majority will be generous and like forgiving and tolerant to you, which isn't something that grants you autonomy. Whereas the mechanism that our member speaker tells you is that you are able to forgive yourself rather than putting and holding you up on a too much of a hard moral standard. The reason why this happens on their side of the bench is if you don't forgive other individuals for making mistakes or making wrongdoings, then others will question your morality as well. So if you say, hey, if you don't like forgive this person, have you really done something that's morally perfect on your like life as well? But second, you have that inherent internal questioning process within your brain as well. Hey, I'm setting up a super high standard for other people. Am I really that morally perfect as well? And I think this is bad because cognitive dissonance is important. Note, this debate is a regrets motion. For the vast majority of history of humanity, homosexuals have been harmed and has been criticized for committing moral wrongdoings. That people who commit abortion have been criticized for committing murder. It's your ability and your autonomy to think on yourself that you're able to forgive yourself. Therefore, that even if I committed an abortion, I can be forgiven. I can live a morally better life. Even if I am a homosexual, I can live a better life. It's super empowering because this narrative takes place in a whole host of human history. And for the vast majority of history, the artificial outside concept of morality has been built on a very arbitrary and an unequal manner. This narrative is a personal narrative. So if you look at how when people are killed, when people are raped, no one says you should forgive your rapist. That is just not how this narrative looks like and plays out in reality. It empowers people by saying that you're able to set the standard of morality. And it especially is important in conservative societies, which for the vast majority of humanity, this has been the true characterization. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition for their speech. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 24 seconds. Thank you all debaters so much for that debate. We are going to have a 10-minute recess and then come back and discuss the debate. For the show debaters, if you want to receive feedback, that is fine. If you want to stay for Chumbam lecture, that is also very, very welcome. Again, thank you guys so much for helping us out. And we'll see everyone in 10 more minutes, or 4:20, please.